What happens when a fighter plane built to hunt other fighter planes at 30,000 feet gets sent down into the mud to hunt tanks instead? What do you do when your entire armored counterattack, the one your own field marshal promised would split the American beachhead in two, gets caught in the open by aircraft nobody warned you about? And what does a German panzer commander write in his after-action report when his Tiger tank, thick enough to shrug off most anti-tank guns, gets torn open by a fighter plane strafing him from behind and below, skipping bullets under his own hull like stones across a pond? On the night of August 6, 1944, near a French town called Mortain, the German 7th Army launched the counterattack meant to save the entire Normandy campaign. By the following afternoon, it was burning in a field, and pilots flying a fighter that was never designed for this job were the reason why. We'll show you exactly how the P-47 Thunderbolt learned to kill tanks in a moment. First, you need to understand why nobody, not even the Americans who built it, expected this particular aircraft to become the single most feared thing in the sky over the German army in the summer of 1944. This is the story of the Jug. This is the story of how a fighter plane became a tank's worst nightmare. The threat when the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt entered combat over Europe in the spring of 1943. It was designed and flown almost exclusively as a high-altitude escort fighter, a massive, heavily armed aircraft built to protect American bomber formations from German interceptors on the long, dangerous runs deep into occupied Europe. It was, by any measure, an enormous machine for a single-engine fighter, so large that German pilots sometimes mistook it for a twin-engine aircraft on first sighting. And its size and weight made it a genuinely mediocre dogfighter at low altitude when compared to the nimble Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs it regularly faced. Nobody involved in its original design specification had ground attack in mind at all. The aircraft's early reputation among American pilots themselves was, in fact, decidedly mixed. Pilots transitioning from lighter, more agile fighters often found the Thunderbolt's sheer bulk intimidating at first. A machine that felt, in the words of pilots who flew it in those early months, more like wrestling a piece of heavy machinery through the sky than flying a conventional fighter. It took real time and real combat experience for the wider fighter community to appreciate what that bulk actually offered in exchange for its lack of nimbleness. A level of structural toughness and raw diving speed that few other Allied or German fighters of the era could match. Colonel Hubert Zemke, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, was among the first to systematically develop tactics that leaned into these strengths rather than fighting against them, teaching his pilots to use the Thunderbolt's exceptional dive speed to disengage from or reposition against more maneuverable German fighters, rather than attempting to outturn them in a classic dogfight. That same emphasis on using the aircraft's raw physical toughness and speed, rather than trying to make it into something more delicate and agile than it was ever going to be, would prove just as important once the Thunderbolt's mission shifted from the high skies over Germany to the low, dangerous airspace above the Normandy battlefield. But by the summer of 1944, the tactical picture in Europe had changed completely. The P-51 Mustang, faster and longer-ranged, had taken over the primary bomber escort mission, and the 9th Air Force's Thunderbolt groups found themselves reassigned to a role nobody had originally planned for them, flying low over the Normandy battlefield in direct support of advancing American ground troops. What they discovered, almost by accident, was that the very qualities that made the P-47 a merely adequate high-altitude dogfighter, its massive weight, its rugged air-cooled radial engine, its ability to absorb enormous punishment and keep flying, made it exceptionally, unexpectedly well-suited to an entirely different kind of war. A war fought at treetop height, diving on German armor through a hail of anti-aircraft fire that would have shredded a lighter, more fragile aircraft in seconds. The German army that the P-47 pilots encountered over Normandy in the summer of 1944 still possessed some of the most powerful armored formations in the entire war, including Tiger and Panther tanks whose frontal armor could shrug off most American anti-tank guns entirely. What German commanders had not fully accounted for was what happened when those same tanks, formidable against ground fire, were caught in the open, on a road, with nowhere to hide from an aircraft attacking from above and behind. The bocage terrain of Normandy itself, dense hedgerows dividing the countryside into a maze of small enclosed fields, had initially seemed to favor the German defense, providing natural cover from ground observation and slowing the American advance to a grinding, hedgerow-by-hedgerow crawl through most of June and early July. But that same terrain, once American forces finally broke out of it during Operation Cobra, created a different kind of vulnerability entirely. German armor and vehicles, funneled onto the limited network of usable roads by the difficulty of moving heavy equipment through the hedgerows themselves, became far more predictable and far more exposed once they were forced into the open to relocate or counterattack at any real speed. It was precisely this combination, powerful armor that depended on road movement to be tactically useful, meeting fighter bombers that had just been handed the specific job of hunting exactly that kind of movement, that set the stage for what followed. The secret development there was no single secret weapon that turned the P-47 into a tank killer. What there was instead was a group of aggressive pilots willing to experiment with tactics nobody had written into any manual, refined through trial, error, and a great deal of nerve, until they had turned a high-altitude fighter into one of the most effective ground attack aircraft of the entire war. Major Glenn Duncan of the 353rd Fighter Group had begun pioneering low-level strafing and dive-bombing tactics with the Thunderbolt months before the Normandy invasion even began, developing the basic playbook that 9th Air Force squadrons would refine and scale up dramatically once the ground campaign in France began in earnest. The approach that emerged combined the P-47's heavy armament, 8 50-caliber machine guns capable of devastating short bursts, with its ability to carry bombs and rockets, allowing a single aircraft to strafe, bomb, and strafe again on successive passes against a single target. Pilots developed a specific technique for attacking German armor from behind and below, a maneuver some called skip firing, deliberately walking their 50-caliber rounds along the ground so they would skip upward under a tank's rear hull, where armor was thinnest and fuel and engine compartments were most exposed. Coming in low, fast, and from an angle German tank crews rarely expected, pilots would open fire at full power, hold the trigger through the pass, and then pull away at maximum speed, specifically to outrun the tank turret's ability to traverse and track them before a second aircraft or a second pass could finish the job. It was dangerous, exhausting work, flown low enough that a moment's miscalculation meant flying directly into the ground, and it was flown again and again, sortie after sortie, until it became a genuinely reliable method for suppressing and disabling armor that had been considered nearly invulnerable to conventional ground fire. The physical toll this kind of flying took on pilots deserves its own mention, because it was substantial and largely invisible to anyone who did not experience it directly. Diving at high speed toward the ground, pulling out at the last possible moment to avoid impact, and repeating that maneuver multiple times per sortie subjected pilots to sustained high G forces that pushed the human body to its physiological limits. Some pilots who flew this kind of mission regularly described routinely approaching the edge of blacking out during the pull-up from a dive, a risk they accepted as simply part of the job, because pulling out too early meant a wasted pass, and pulling out too late meant flying directly into the terrain they were attacking, combined with the very real threat of concentrated German anti-aircraft fire, which grew increasingly dense and increasingly well-coordinated as the campaign wore on. Low-level tank hunting missions carried a level of physical and psychological strain that pilots flying pure air-to-air missions at high altitude rarely had to contend with in the same sustained way. Technical supremacy. There is no chapter in this story about a single miracle weapon, because what made the P-47 so effective in this new role was the combination of several ordinary components used in an entirely unconventional way. The Thunderbolt's air-cooled radial engine proved to be an enormous tactical advantage in exactly the kind of low-level combat this new role demanded. Unlike a liquid-cooled engine, which could be knocked out of action by a single hit to its cooling system, the P-47's radial engine could absorb significant battle damage. Individual cylinders shot out, oil lines punctured, structural damage from flak and ground fire, and often keep running long enough to get its pilot home. That durability let pilots press their attacks closer and more aggressively than they otherwise would have dared, diving through concentrated German anti-aircraft fire that would have been suicidal in a more fragile airframe. The results, once this combination of firepower, tactics, and durability came together over the Normandy battlefield, were dramatic. During Operation Cobra in late July 1944, P-47 groups tore into German armored columns attempting to counter the American breakout, and the aircraft's role only grew more decisive in the days that followed. When Adolf Hitler personally ordered a major armored counterattack at Mortain on the night of August 6th, intended to cut through the American lines and reach the coast, splitting the advancing armies in two. The operation ran directly into a wall of Allied fighter bombers the moment weather cleared enough to fly. 9th Air Force Thunderbolts, flying what became known as armored column cover, ranged ahead of and around American ground units, hunting the German tanks, half-tracks, and vehicles attempting to press the attack. Daily action reports from Thunderbolt squadrons during this period describe strikes against German armored columns in blunt, methodical language. Vehicles left burning, half-tracks destroyed at road junctions, entire convoys strafed and bombed until movement became effectively impossible during daylight hours. The armored column cover concept itself represented a genuine tactical innovation worth understanding on its own terms. Rather than simply waiting to be called in for a specific strike, Thunderbolt squadrons flew standing patrols directly above advancing American armored columns, in constant radio contact with a forward air controller riding in a tank or vehicle within the column itself. That controller could direct aircraft onto emerging threats, an ambush position, a German tank the column had not yet spotted, an artillery battery ranging in from a tree line, within minutes rather than the hours a traditional request and response air support system might require. For the American tank crews on the ground, this meant advancing under what amounted to a continuous, responsive aerial shield, one that fundamentally changed the calculus of German ambush tactics that had worked effectively in the hedgerow fighting weeks earlier. A German anti-tank gun crew that revealed its position to destroy an American tank now had to reckon with the very real possibility that a Thunderbolt circling nearby would locate and destroy that position within minutes of the American column reporting contact. The global impact, the Mortain counterattack, meant to be the operation that saved the German position in Normandy, collapsed within roughly 48 hours, badly mauled by a combination of determined American ground resistance and relentless fighter-bomber attacks that made it nearly impossible for German armor to maneuver or resupply in daylight. What followed compounded the disaster. As German forces attempted to withdraw eastward through the shrinking gap between the American and Canadian-British armies near the towns of Falaise and Argentan, Allied fighter bombers, Thunderbolts prominent among them, caught the retreating columns on the roads in one of the most concentrated aerial destruction events of the entire war in Europe. The stretch of road and countryside where this occurred became known afterward, on both sides of the fighting, as the Corridor of Death, a term that requires little further explanation once you understand what happened there. German soldiers who survived the Falaise pocket and the broader Normandy campaign consistently described the psychological weight of facing these aircraft in terms that went beyond simple casualty figures. The German nickname for Allied fighter bombers, Jabo, short for Jagd bomber, became a word soldiers used with genuine dread, a shorthand for an entirely new kind of exposure that made daylight movement of any kind, whether by tank column, supply truck, or individual staff car, a calculated risk that commanders increasingly had to plan entire operations around avoiding. Movement that had once been routine, resupply runs, repositioning, even simple reconnaissance, now had to be conducted at night or through painstaking camouflage discipline, specifically because a Thunderbolt pilot circling overhead in daylight represented a threat that German ground forces had no reliable answer for. Post-war ground analysis of destroyed vehicles in the Corridor of Death would later complicate the simplest version of this story, finding that a meaningful share of wrecked German armor had actually been abandoned, out of fuel, or destroyed by their own crews rather than knocked out directly by air attack. But that more careful accounting does not erase the central fact that mattered most to the men on the ground at the time. The constant, inescapable presence of Thunderbolts overhead had made it impossible for the German 7th Army to move, resupply, or organize an orderly withdrawal, and that paralysis, air attack, and its psychological weight combined was every bit as decisive as a direct kill count alone could ever show. That distinction between vehicles destroyed directly by air attack and vehicles abandoned or scuttled because their crews could not move or resupply them under the threat of air attack matters enormously for understanding what actually happened at Falaise, and it does not diminish the Thunderbolt's role so much as clarify it. A tank column with no fuel, stranded on a road it dared not travel in daylight, surrounded by wreckage from earlier strikes and unable to receive resupply because every truck attempting to reach it risked the same fate, faces a kind of defeat that a simple kill count entirely misses. German quartermasters attempting to sustain the retreat through the shrinking Falaise pocket found their supply lines effectively severed not because every single truck was destroyed, but because the credible threat of destruction made sustained daylight movement of any kind an unacceptable gamble. That is the fuller, more accurate picture of what Allied air power, Thunderbolts prominent among the aircraft responsible, actually accomplished in the final days of the Normandy campaign, not simply killing tanks one at a time, but breaking the German army's ability to function as a coordinated, mobile force at all. Conclusion: the P-47 Thunderbolt was never supposed to be a tank killer. It was designed, tested, and initially deployed as a high-altitude bomber escort, and by the standards of pure air-to-air dogfighting against the best German fighters, it was never the most elegant aircraft in the sky. But American pilots, given a new mission and the freedom to experiment with tactics nobody had written down in advance, turned the Thunderbolt's very bulk and ruggedness, the qualities that made it merely adequate against a Messerschmitt at altitude, into exactly the qualities needed to survive and dominate a completely different kind of war fought at treetop height against some of the most powerful tanks ever built. By the time the Normandy campaign reached its brutal conclusion at Falaise, the aircraft that German soldiers had learned to fear more than almost anything else in the Allied arsenal was not a heavy bomber or a specialized dive bomber built from the ground up for exactly this purpose. It was a fighter plane that had simply been sent down low, handed a new job, and flown by pilots aggressive and skilled enough to figure out, through repeated trial in genuinely mortal combat, exactly how to make an aircraft built for one war contribute decisively to an entirely different one instead. The tanks that survived Normandy carried that lesson home with them. The ones that didn't left it burning on the roads around Mortain and Falaise, in a corridor of death that a fighter plane nobody had designed for the job helped create. The P-47's second career, as it were, did not end with the closing of the Falaise pocket in August of 1944. Thunderbolts continued flying armored column cover and close air support missions across the remainder of the campaign in France, through the brutal winter fighting of the Battle of the Bulge, where their ground attack capability again proved essential in blunting German armored thrusts through the Ardennes, and on into the final push across the Rhine into Germany itself. By the war's end, the aircraft that had begun its combat career as a high-altitude bomber escort had flown hundreds of thousands of combat sorties in the ground attack role, a testament to just how completely American pilots had reinvented the purpose of an airframe that its own designers had never imagined fighting a war quite like this one.